April 1945, Okinawa is burning. The night air above Hacksaw Ridge pulses with heat and cordite, thick with the smell of wet earth and ruptured steel. Somewhere in the dark, magnesium flares bleed across the sky, turning mangled figures into frozen silhouettes for seconds at a time. The plateau at the top of the escarpment is a graveyard of twisted rifles, shattered helmets, and men who no longer breathe. Below the cliff's sharp edge, the jungle waits in silence, broken only by distant artillery thuds that echo like slow heartbeats. The wind carries whispers through the smoke, the kind men imagine when they are too tired to move and too scared to sleep. Then, faintly, a voice, low, steady, almost drowned by gunfire. Just one more, not a command, not a prayer meant for ears, a promise spoken into chaos. Up above, the battlefield has already swallowed dozens, but one figure still moves where others lie still, crawling through fire, reaching into shadow, dragging the wounded from a place even fear refuses to enter. They had mocked him for refusing a rifle, labeled him weak before a single shot was fired. And yet on this ridge, under the broken sky of Okinawa, the word coward is about to lose all meaning, as dawn edges closer and the impossible begins to take shape in the darkness. By the spring of 1945, the war in the Pacific had become something different from anything the United States had known before. This was no longer a campaign of island hopping measured in miles gained and harbors seized. It had become a slow descent into brutality, a grinding war of attrition against an enemy that refused surrender, even in defeat. With Germany collapsing in Europe, the full weight of American power swung westward across the Pacific Ocean, toward a final objective everyone feared but few spoke aloud: the Japanese home islands. Okinawa lay directly in that path. It was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War and the bloodiest. On April 1st, 1945, more than 180,000 U.S. troops assaulted the island in a single massive landing across the Higuchi beaches. The operation carried a name that barely hinted at what would come: Operation Iceberg. Okinawa was not simply another island. It was only 340 miles from Japan's mainland. From its airfields, American bombers could reach Tokyo and return. From its harbors, an invasion fleet could launch the final assault. To the war planners, it was a strategic jewel. To the men ordered to take it, it would become hell. The Japanese command understood this as well as the Americans did. Instead of contesting the beaches directly, they withdrew into the southern hills of the island and built a labyrinth of underground defenses. The terrain of Okinawa lent itself to resistance: ridges, ravines, limestone caves that burrowed deep into the earth like natural fortresses. Entire regiments vanished into rock and soil, re-emerging only to kill and fade out again. The Japanese intended to bleed the invaders dry. Every yard of ground would be bought with American lives. By the time U.S. forces reached the high ground south of the island, the weather had turned against them. Okinawa's spring rains transformed roads into rivers of mud. Equipment sank into the earth. Tanks drowned in craters. The wounded lay exposed in open fields with little shelter as monsoon winds tore at their bandages, and artillery shattered whatever cover they could find. The battlefield itself seemed alive, grinding, swallowing, refusing to release anyone who entered. Hacksaw Ridge rose like a blade from this chaos. It was not a ridge in the gentle sense of the word. It was a sheer cliff, nearly 400 feet of jagged vertical rock, overlooking a narrow plateau that the Japanese had fortified with the machine gun nests, mortar positions, and miles of hidden tunnels. To reach the top, American soldiers climbed a rope cargo net under fire. The climb exposed them completely. Snipers waited, artillery waited. The defenders had perfect sight lines. Every body hanging on that rope was a target in motion. The 77th Infantry Division would be the ones to climb it. This was not a famous unit like the Marines at Iwo Jima or the paratroopers of Normandy. The 77th were Easterners, many from New York and New Jersey, men who had never seen jungle warfare, never felt heat cling like a second skin, or rain that soaked through steel. They were a fresh division thrown into a war that no longer resembled anything taught in training manuals. When they were ordered to take the escarpment, they knew only two things: the ridge had to fall, and the cost would be unbearable. Among the men climbing that rope was a private from Virginia, Desmond Doss. He did not carry a rifle. He did not carry a pistol. He did not carry a blade. While the men around him loaded grenades and clutched M1 Garands, Doss ascended with nothing but a medic's bag and a Bible, not because he was unarmed by accident, but because he refused to carry a weapon at all. It wasn't fear that stopped him, nor politics, nor protest. It was faith. Doss had been raised in a Seventh-day Adventist household, a church with deep convictions about pacifism, the sanctity of life, and strict observance of the Sabbath. His mother had taught him the commandments with the intensity most parents save for bedtime stories. One stood out in particular, "Thou shalt not kill." For Doss, it was not a phrase to interpret. It was a law to obey. Growing up during the Great Depression in Lynchburg, Virginia, Doss watched his father come apart after work shifts and war memories from another time. He saw alcohol hollow out men who had once held families together. Violence in his home left a mark he never spoke about, but never forgot. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Doss did not hesitate to enlist, but he made one promise to himself. He would serve without shedding blood. The Army did not know what to do with men like him. He was not the first conscientious objector in American history, but what made Doss different was that he did not refuse the battlefield. He refused only the gun. While others requested safe harbor and non-combat roles, Doss volunteered to be a medic, the job with the highest fatality rate in some Pacific campaigns. He was willing to go anywhere, face anything, as long as he did not have to take life to do it. On paper, it made no sense. In the eyes of his fellow soldiers, it made him suspicious. By the time the 77th Division reached Okinawa, Doss was already known within his company, not for bravery, but for being different, awkward, quiet, always reading scripture, always volunteering for medical drills, never swearing, refusing to train with weapons even when ordered. While others learned to shoot, Doss learned how to stop bleeding. While his unit practiced killing, he practiced healing, and war has never been kind to men who stand apart. At Hacksaw Ridge, no one knew his name yet, not in history, not in headlines. He was just another medic on a battlefield that devoured medics the way the sea devours ships. But the Ridge was about to expose something no drill instructor could teach, something even Doss himself did not yet understand. Because some men are tested by how well they fight, others are tested by how much they are willing to endure without fighting at all. And harsh judgments, whispered behind helmets and scribbled into rumors, were about to follow Desmond Doss into the black mouth of battle, climbing beside him on that rope, tying themselves to his name, long before his actions would ever untie them. The war around him was only just beginning to tighten its grip. Desmond Doss arrived in the Army not as a hero, but as a problem. At Fort Jackson, South Carolina, during basic training, the Army tried to shape him like it did every other raw recruit, with shouting, repetition, and rifles. Men were broken down and rebuilt into soldiers by routine, dawn formations, forced marches, weapons drills. They learned to fire, to reload, to bayonet dummies in the chest without hesitation. The rifle was not just equipment, it was identity. It was survival. To refuse it was to refuse the uniform itself. And Doss refused. He refused to touch a weapon, refused to practice with one, refused to even lift one from the rack. He did so quietly, respectfully, and without apology. He did not argue theology. He simply said he could not carry a weapon because he could not kill, not even to save himself. It did not go over well. The military had rules for conscientious objection, but few imagined a man who would accept frontline duty while rejecting the one tool considered essential to survive it. Officers grew suspicious. Some assumed cowardice dressed up as religion. Others viewed him as mentally unfit for service. And among his fellow recruits, frustration curdled into rage. He was ridiculed during drills, threatened in the barracks, intentionally struck during training exercises. When the company learned that one of their own would go into combat without a rifle, the mood changed. Soldiers began to worry, not just about him, but about themselves. Would he freeze under fire? Would he become a liability? Would his hesitation get someone else killed? In the military, there is a distinct hierarchy of respect. On one end are those who pull weight. On the other are those who become weight. And from the beginning, many in Doss's unit believed he was the latter. Things escalated. NCOs reported his refusal as insubordination. Commanding officers attempted to break him, ordering him to carry a rifle, punishing him when he refused. He was threatened with court-martial. At one point, paperwork was drafted to have him discharged dishonorably. But something curious happened. Whenever another soldier collapsed during training, Doss was right there. Heat stroke, fractured limbs, falls from obstacle courses. He ran toward pain when others ran past it. His medical training was flawless. He volunteered for the most unpleasant duties. He cleaned wounds without complaint. He carried men twice his weight when no one else could. Slowly, subtle contradictions began forming around him. The man who wouldn't hold a rifle would carry anyone. Still, tolerance was thin. When orders came for deployment, several men in his unit reportedly made open threats, saying he'd better sleep with one eye open on the battlefield. Some believed he wouldn't make it off the boat alive. Others believed fate would solve the problem for them. By early 1945, Doss and the 77th Infantry Division sailed west, finally crossing the invisible boundary between training and war. Incomplete rumors traveled with them. Some knew him as the preacher, others as Holy Joe, some as a coward, some as an oddity no one understood. When they hit Okinawa sands, nothing stopped. The beach was chaos, smashed landing craft, wounded men piled into shallow craters, engineers racing to clear paths through shellfire. There was no glorious first step, only noise and confusion and wet boots sinking into red mud. Once ashore, the division pushed south. The hills grew steeper, the skies darker, the resistance heavier. The Japanese were waiting. Each ridge fought back like a living organism. Attacks came from nowhere and everywhere. Every crest revealed another maze of tunnels, another web of machine guns. Medics were among the first to be targeted. The Japanese understood something the Americans were only beginning to realize. Killing medics was as effective as killing infantry. Without treatment, wounds became death sentences. This was the world Doss entered unarmed, not as a symbol, not as a statement, but as a medic in a kill zone. As the 77th drew closer to Hacksaw Ridge, the terrain sharpened. The plateau at the top of the cliff became the primary objective in that sector. Japanese artillery zeroed in every approach. Units stalled, then broke, then regrouped again. The ridge loomed overhead like a silent executioner. Soldiers heard about it before they saw it. They spoke of the climb in low voices, of ropes slick with blood, of bodies hitting rock halfway down, of men screaming until they weren't. When the time came to assault the escarpment, Doss climbed with the rest. No ceremony, no special assignment, no separation. Just another body on the rope, rising toward death. Up top, American units secured the plateau, briefly. But the Japanese counterattack came fast and merciless. Soldiers fought face to face. Grenades exploded inside foxholes. Flame weapons smoked entire ridgelines. For every yard gained, blood soaked into earth that refused to dry. Then, late one evening, the order came. Withdraw. The position was no longer tenable. Casualties were too high, ammunition low, morale fracturing. Units pulled back in darkness, guided by instinct more than command. One by one, soldiers descended the rope, but not all of them left. Wounded men lay scattered across the plateau, some trapped in shell holes, some bleeding out behind jagged stone, some too shattered to cry out. Under cover of night, Japanese patrols moved through the same darkness. Every man left behind was already marked, and amid that retreat, amid exhaustion, terror, and the desperate urge to survive, a lone figure did something no table of organization would ever account for. He stayed. Desmond Doss did not climb down. The ridge swallowed his silhouette, and the men who had mocked him would not see him again, at least not for many hours. The battlefield seemed to close over him. The rope swayed quietly, and above it, the night waited. Belief is an abstract thing, until bullets give it a body. On Hacksaw Ridge, Desmond Doss's faith was no longer a quiet set of convictions tucked inside a pocket-sized Bible. It was forced into the open, torn against shrapnel and steel, measured against fear in its rawest form. The idea of refusing violence feels manageable in a church pew. It feels noble at a distance. But in the dark, with mortars walking closer and bodies bleeding out inches from your boots, faith becomes something else entirely. It becomes endurance. Doss did not offer sermons on the ridge. He did not preach to the wounded. There was no luxury for philosophies while men writhed in pain. What he offered instead was presence, unmoving, relentless. Where others measured time in minutes until the next barrage, Doss measured it in heartbeats to the next breath he could save. His prayer was not theatrical. It was repeated, again and again. Just one more. Not for survival, for service. He did not expect to live through the night. He did not bargain for safety. He did not wait for miraculous intervention. He simply asked for the strength to keep moving while others could not. In a world built around destruction, Doss made healing into an act of resistance. Every tourniquet wrapped, every body dragged back from darkness, became defiance against a battlefield that demanded surrender. And staying required more courage than leaving ever could, because the deeper fear was not death itself. It was stopping. It was choosing rest, knowing that voices might still whisper from the smoke. Faith, for Doss, was never about safety. It was about obligation, and on that ridge, obligation became heavier with every man he carried. Angle 2, the leadership angle, command versus conscience. Military leadership depends on structure, obedience, hierarchy. But Desmond Doss represented something every commanding officer feared, a man who obeyed quietly until conscience intervened. Then, without rage or theatrics, he stopped. That made him unpredictable. And unpredictability in war is a threat. His officers had tried to bend him, pressured him, threatened him. None of it worked, and the problem was not only discipline, it was precedent. If one soldier could refuse orders, what stopped others? The army could accommodate religion, but it needed loyalty to command just as desperately. To allow exception was weakness. To enforce obedience was necessary. But Hacksaw Ridge rearranged that equation. When officers gave the order to withdraw, it was followed without controversy. It was logical, strategic. Lives were being lost for every hour gained. The ridge was not worth annihilation. Doctrine demanded a retreat, and Doss obeyed, in a way. He did not disobey the withdrawal order. He completed a different one, the unspoken one, the one every leader hopes his men will follow, even if it is never written. No one left behind. While leaders reorganized below the ridge, Doss reorganized something else, expectation. He was no longer a problem to manage. He became a responsibility to understand. By dawn, when survivors emerged, officers would no longer see a soldier who refused to carry a rifle. They would see a medic who had outperformed every weapon on the field. Leadership, for the first time, was forced to concede something uncomfortable. That discipline might look like obedience, but courage sometimes looks like refusal. Angle 3, the tactical angle. A medic in a kill zone. War is designed for destruction. And medics step into it carrying the opposite intention. On Hacksaw Ridge, the terrain did not forgive mistakes. The plateau was small, exposed, pockmarked by shell holes that trapped blast waves inside flesh. There was no cover that lasted, no safety that stuck. For a medic, this environment was a maze of death. Gunfire did not pause for first aid. Artillery did not care for blood types, and the Japanese did not spare the wounded. In many Pacific engagements, medics were deliberately targeted, not because they fought, but because they kept others alive. Take the healer away, and the rifle becomes useless when its owner is bleeding out in the mud. Doss knew this, and yet he operated openly. He ran without cover, crawled without warning, stood up when every instinct screamed to stay prone. His position became known not by shout or signal, but by movement. Wherever blood flowed, Doss followed it, and every trip through gunfire was an invitation for death. But he did not operate recklessly. He used darkness. He waited for lulls between artillery. He listened. Every decision was calculated, not by strategy, but by necessity. He learned where the ridge swallowed sound, where smoke drifted thickest, where bullets traveled worst. Every rescue was a calculated gamble, not just with his life, with time, with noise, with breath. Medics are trained to stabilize the wounded. Doss was doing something else. He was retrieving lives from a place no one else would enter, and the battlefield noticed. These were the forces pulling against Desmond Doss from every direction. Faith against fear, command against conscience, medicine against massacre. But the ridge had not finished revealing him. What remained unseen was the enemy's side, the weight inside the minds of the men pulling the triggers, and the psychological fracture caused when a man walks into fire without returning it. Angle 4, the enemy angle, the Japanese defense from below the ridge. From the perspective of the Japanese defenders, Hacksaw Ridge was not just terrain. It was a final lungful of breath. By April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army no longer fought for expansion. It fought to slow inevitability. Okinawa was not expected to survive. The command understood this. The defenders entrenched themselves for one purpose alone: to delay the Americans at any cost. Below the ridge, Japanese soldiers lived like ghosts. They slept in damp tunnels carved from limestone with bare hands. They rationed water, hoarded bullets, ate what little could be scavenged. Disease was as common as ammunition, and retreat was not an option, neither tactically nor psychologically. Surrender was not doctrine, it was dishonor. The ridge was a trap by design. Machine guns were zeroed for the rope climbs. Mortars were hidden beneath foliage. Ambush points were memorized like hymns. The plateau became a slaughter zone, not from chaos, but from calculation. Every American who crested the ridge did so under perfectly aligned fire. From the Japanese perspective, medics were prime targets, not because of malice, because of math. If wounded men could not be stabilized, they would die, and instability meant collapse. Yet on that night, something disrupted the pattern. The expected silence between barrages was broken by movement. One man, over and over, dragging bodies away from darkness. From inside the tunnels and foxholes, Japanese soldiers watched this anomaly with confusion. No rifle, no grenades, just a shadow moving without retaliation. To some, he looked unreal. To others, insane. There are no official records from Japanese soldiers about Doss that night. No journals recovered that named him. No personal testimonies recorded for history. But the absence itself tells a story. Because surviving enemy accounts from Okinawa often mention something else. They mention confusion. Moments when fire was withheld because a soldier did not present as a threat. Moments when hesitation replaced instinct. And in war, hesitation is deadly, not for the enemy, for the hand that refuses to pull the trigger. Angle 5, the moral angle, conscience in a world built on command. War erases nuance. It rewards simplicity. Kill, advance, survive. Anyone who complicates that formula becomes a problem. And Desmond Doss was complicated. He did not bargain with his beliefs. He did not negotiate with death. He did not bend his convictions to fit the uniform. Instead, he wore the uniform and carried conviction into places where conviction is usually burned out of men. The moral weight of his refusal was heavy, not because it endangered others, but because it challenged them. It raised silent questions. If one man could endure without killing, what does that say about the ones who did? Not accusation, reflection. And reflection is dangerous in war. It breaks cohesion. It weakens certainty. But something unexpected happened. Instead of weakening others, Doss exposed something about them they had forgotten. Fear was universal. But so was mercy. They had not abandoned humanity. They had buried it. Doss did not come with a weapon. He came with reminder. And under that shell-torn sky, reminder became rebellion. Every life he saved was an argument. Not shouted, not written, but bleeding. The ridge wasn't just a battlefield. It was a referendum on violence, and Doss cast his vote one wounded man at a time. Angle 6, the psychological angle. What a man becomes when he refuses to kill. Killing changes soldiers. Refusing to kill changes them too, but differently. War teaches muscle memory. Flinch, aim, fire. Neural pathways are cut deep by repetition. Fear becomes reflex. Survival becomes instinct. Doss lived inside the same artillery storms, but his hands learned a different pattern. Press, wrap, lift, pull. Where others rehearsed destruction, he practiced construction. And psychologically, that matters. Not because it makes one superior, but because it makes one alien. Inside a platoon, uniformity is safety. Sameness is camouflage. And Doss was unmistakably different. He did not become hardened. He became focused, not in rage, in mission. The wounded became coordinates. Breathing became his measure of success. Pulse became priority. While others disassociated from carnage to survive, Doss leaned into suffering to heal it. And that inversion took a toll. Carrying men while being fired upon fractures the soul. Seeing death up close, again and again, without the emotional outlet of rage, leaves wounds without vents. But Doss did not unravel. He endured, not because he was immune, because he was anchored. His faith did not erase trauma, it absorbed it. And that is heavier to carry than any pack. All of these angles, enemy confusion, moral gravity, command tension, psychological strain, would collide in a single moment. When one man stood alone on a ridge, refusing to leave while death circled him, the angles were done, the night was not, and the battlefield was about to make its final demand. Night swallowed Hacksaw Ridge whole, not gently, not peacefully. It smothered it. By the time the last American soldiers descended the rope net, darkness had settled in thick layers, smoke, fog, and the ache of men who had survived just long enough to feel it. Artillery tapered into distant thunder, rifles quieted. The ridge exhaled as if the earth itself were catching its breath. Everything indicated retreat. Everything except one shadow. Desmond Doss remained. Above him, the plateau was a field of wreckage. Bodies lay where they had fallen, twisted, burned, collapsed in shapes that only war produces. Some still breathed, most did not. The air smelled of blood and cordite, and damp earth churned by boots and explosions. Wind crept through shattered trees and rustling ponchos, making the ridge sound haunted. Doss moved anyway. He did not sprint. He moved in fragments. Crawl, stop, listen, crawl again. Every sound mattered. A falling rock could be nothing, or the last warning before a bayonet appeared from darkness. Japanese patrols moved through the same night, sometimes only yards away. Doss could hear them. Murmured voices, shifting feet, the metallic whisper of rifle parts brushed by clothing. He learned to breathe shallow. He learned to freeze when the ridge went still. Then he heard it, breathing. Not healthy breathing. The wet, rasping kind that comes from lungs filling the wrong way. He found the first man face down near a shattered machine gun nest, unconscious, bleeding from the thigh. Doss cut cloth with his fingers, tied a tourniquet by feel alone. He worked without light. He worked by memory. There was no luxury of perfection, only speed, only pressure, only silence. When the man's bleeding slowed, Doss dragged him. Every inch across rock scraped against skin. The slope toward the cliff edge was uneven. Shattered stones slid beneath boots. He nearly lost footing twice. When he reached the escarpment, he stared down into nothing. 400 feet of black air and jungle waited below. The rope was still there, tied to a root, frayed, damp with blood. Doss tied the other end around the wounded man's chest with a knot he had learned in training. Then he did something no manual prepared him for. He pushed, not hard, with hope. The body slid, then vanished. The rope went taut and hummed into the dark. Doss listened, heart pounding. Seconds passed. Then, faint from below, a shout, not a scream, a living sound. Doss dropped to his knees and whispered thanks to a sky he couldn't see. Then he stood and moved again. Each rescue followed a rhythm: find, stabilize, drag, lower, repeat. Time disintegrated. Minutes stretched into lifetimes. The sky began its slow change from black to charcoal gray. Still, voices called out. Still, bodies moved when touched. Still, he answered. He reached a group of 3 men huddled in a shell crater. 1 dead, 2 alive, both burned, 1 couldn't walk. Doss patched what he could, lifted with legs shaking beneath his weight, pulled them from the crater as flares burst above him, exposing his outline against smoke and flame. Bullets cracked overhead. He flattened, waited, then pulled again. He dragged another man by the webbing of his pack. The straps cut into his palms until he didn't feel it anymore. He bit his lip until blood mixed with rain. His muscles burned like fire beneath skin. Then something struck him. Not a bullet, a blast. He was thrown against rock, lungs crushed by invisible force, and still he rose, and still he moved. He no longer counted rescues, he counted breaths. He was emptying the ridge one life at a time. Then came the moment he himself became a casualty. A grenade exploded near his feet. Shrapnel tore flesh from bone. He collapsed. For a long moment, there was no movement. When he woke, blood pooled beneath him. His leg burned in ways language cannot capture. Still, he tried to stand. Failed, then crawled. Not for safety, for someone else. Nearby, another wounded man cried out. Doss dragged himself, broken leg and all, across exposed ground until he reached him. He patched him with hands that shook violently. Then began the slow process of hauling again. And something else happened. A sniper's bullet tore through Doss's left arm, entered above the elbow, shattered bone, exit unknown. For a moment, he stared at the wound like it belonged to someone else. His arm hung wrong, his blood soaked into mud. He did not scream. Instead, he looked at the man beside him and finished the rescue. Only then did he allow himself to sink backward. He tried to signal the rope, tried to lift his good arm. Darkness blurred his vision. Morning had come, and the ridge was almost empty. Down below, soldiers began to realize something was wrong. The rope moved again, and again. Broken bodies kept coming, but no man came down. Not until the final silhouette appeared, staggering, bleeding, alone. His men did not recognize him at first. Then someone shouted his name, not in anger, not in mockery, with awe and disbelief. The ridge that had consumed so many had finally yielded one man back, and he carried something heavier than wounds with him. He carried silence, because every man watching him climb down knew something had changed, not in the war, but in them. The ridge was cleared, the day belonged to the living. And the story of one man, once whispered in ridicule, was now being rewritten by the weight of 75 lives. But the battlefield was not finished with Desmond Doss yet, and neither was history. Morning light did not arrive gently on Hacksaw Ridge. It uncovered it, layer by layer, wound by wound. What night had hidden, dawn exposed without mercy. The plateau was a mosaic of destruction, bodies half buried in mud, shattered equipment tangled with limbs, dried blood turning black in the humid air. The ridge smelled like iron and smoke and something older, fear that had settled deep into stone. As surviving soldiers emerged from their foxholes below the escarpment, they stared upward as though the ridge itself had changed shape in the dark. Men counted the wounded as they arrived, then counted again and again. The numbers did not make sense. Too many were alive. Too many had come down who were supposed to be dead. Then Desmond Doss came down last. He did not climb, he slid. 2 men had to pull him off the rope as his body sagged against it, blood streaking the fibers red. His uniform was stiff with dried gore. His helmet was gone. His left arm hung useless at his side, mangled beyond recognition. His leg bent at an angle no human joint should ever allow. Yet his eyes were open and clear. No one spoke at first. They stared. The men who had once laughed at him, the ones who had shoved him aside in training, the ones who had called him coward in voices not meant for his ears. They watched as medics rushed forward, real medics now, lifting Doss onto a stretcher. When they cut open his sleeve, the room went silent again. Bone fragments showed white beneath swollen flesh. His body had absorbed wounds meant to kill 10 men. But he was breathing, and breathing changed everything. Someone finally whispered it. 75. That was the count. 75 wounded men pulled from certain death on that ridge. 75 lives wrestled back from darkness by a man with no weapon, no cover, no hope of survival, only refusal. The evacuation was chaotic. The Japanese still held nearby positions. Artillery could begin again at any moment. Stretchers were rushed to transport vehicles. Soldiers shouted coordinates. Doss faded in and out of awareness as the world jerked violently around him. But when another stretcher passed his own, carrying a man more badly wounded than him, Doss stirred. He tried to get up. The medic pushed him back down. Doss insisted. He refused to be evacuated first. Again. Even now. Barely conscious, barely alive, he demanded another go before his own. Finally, a compromise was reached. Only after more severe casualties were loaded did they carry him away. His war was over, but his country had not yet begun to understand what he had done. Doss was transported to a field hospital. Surgeons worked with exhausted precision. The shredded muscles of his arm were cut and cleaned. His leg was set as well as it could be. Infection hovered like a silent executioner. He lay sedated between interventions, hovering in the blurred space between living and not. Word spread anyway. Up the chain, across companies, beyond divisions. By the time he regained consciousness days later, his name was already moving through military channels. Commanding officers began to reconstruct timelines. Eyewitness statements were taken. Men gave testimony not because they were ordered to, but because they needed to. They described what they had seen. A shadow moving through fire. A medic dragging men twice his size. A figure lowering bodies into dark with a rope and a prayer. Some wept as they spoke, some did not. But their voices were the same when they finished. Unsteady. General Douglas MacArthur was informed personally. Anne MacArthur, no stranger to war, no fool for theatrics, did not dismiss it as propaganda. He demanded to meet the man. Months later, as Doss healed in the United States, he was summoned to the White House. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. Truman did not call it a gesture. He reportedly called it an honor greater than being president, and coming from a man who had overseen the end of the war itself, the words carried unusual weight. But for Doss, the medal was heavy for a different reason. It represented men whose names he still remembered, faces he could still see when sleep abandoned him. It did not feel like victory. It felt like obligation sealed in metal. The Army rewrote its records. The same man once considered unfit for service was now immortalized in official commendation. Language changed. Where there had been concern, now there was reverence. Where there had been doubt, now there was certainty. Courage did not wear one uniform. It did not always carry a gun. The Ridge had taught that lesson in blood. Doss never returned to combat. His wounds were too severe. His body was permanently altered. Infection lingered. Pain followed in quiet, relentless ways. Yet, he survived the war. And survival, in his case, seemed almost suspicious. Like something the universe owed him after trying so hard to take him. But the battle had not ended. It had only changed shape, because history had claimed Doss now. And history does not let go gently. The guns had fallen silent on Hacksaw Ridge, but the echo of one man's refusal still lingered. Not as legend, as fact. And that fact would soon confront an entire country that believed strength only came wrapped in steel. The war did not pause to absorb what Desmond Doss had done. Armies rarely stop for heroes. While headlines would eventually carry his name, Okinawa continued burning long after his stretcher left the ridge. The battle dragged on for weeks. More than 82,000 Americans were killed or wounded. Japanese losses dwarfed even that. By the time the island fell in June 1945, over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, and tens of thousands of civilians had been caught in the crossfire. The island was ruined. The sea around it became a grave. Okinawa shocked military planners. It shook the very idea of invasion. The ferocity of Japanese resistance convinced many that an amphibious assault on the home islands would be catastrophic beyond calculation. Men who had fought on the ridge were rotated home with haunted eyes. Generals rewrote projections in darker ink. Casualty estimates for an invasion of Japan rose into the hundreds of thousands. The war seemed endless, until it abruptly wasn't. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Okinawa was still fresh in memory. And Hacksaw Ridge still smelled like blood. The enemy surrendered, and the world exhaled. But for Doss, peace arrived without fanfare. He returned to a country eager to move on. America wanted weddings, factories, songs on the radio. Not the kind of stories that wake you at night. He did not parade his heroism. He recovered. In military hospitals, his body became a project rather than a person. Bones were reset. Infection fought. His left arm would never function the same. His leg ached with cold weather for the rest of his life. Tuberculosis would find him years later, a delayed souvenir from service, forcing the removal of a lung. Doctors saved what they could, but some damage went too deep. Doss rarely spoke about the ridge without prompting. The memories came uninvited, blood on rope fibers, breath slipping away beneath his hands, faces fading in lamplight. And when people asked if he was afraid, he did not romanticize it, he did not pretend he hadn't been. He said he prayed, and then he worked. The Medal of Honor rested in a display case when he wasn't asked to wear it. He did not call it glory, he did not speak of it as reward. To him, it belonged to the men who did not come back, the ones who never heard applause, the ones whose names stayed behind in mud and stone. Even among veterans, his story spread unevenly. Some told it like a miracle, others in quiet respect, some in disbelief. But every retelling carried the same weight, because the details never changed. No rifle, no weapon. 75 men. Night-long rescue. The Army did not know where to file that achievement. It did not fit doctrine. It shattered precedent. And in a post-war military that would soon be defined by nuclear weapons and world-spanning alliances, one man's refusal felt outdated, uncomfortable, but it would not be forgotten. Yet public memory is fragile. It bends toward spectacle. It clings to explosions. Doss did none of that. He saved without spectacle. And decades passed quietly. He married, worked when he could, treated strangers with gentle patience. Classmates' children learned his name in history books without realizing the man still lived somewhere. And then something changed. In the 1990s, the world began rediscovering stories it had misplaced, and one of them had worn bandages instead of medals across a ridge in Okinawa. Stories bubbled back into conversation. Veterans began speaking, archives reopened, and filmmakers finally noticed. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. Desmond Doss did not need embellishment. Reality had already given him something more dangerous than fiction. Silence. What followed was not celebrity. It was something rare, recognition without spectacle. And as his story resurfaced, so did the men who had once doubted him. The ones who now stood in rooms grown quiet whenever his name was spoken. They did not apologize. They did not need to, because memory itself spoke, and it spoke kindly. But history does not end with recognition. It continues through what remains, through what outlives a man, through what he leaves behind. And what Desmond Doss left behind was not simply heroism. It was a question, one that would echo long after medals tarnished and photographs yellowed. What does courage look like when it refuses to kill? Desmond Doss lived the rest of his life quietly, as though history had brushed past him without incident. He did not pursue attention. He did not linger in the glow of his ceremony. He returned to carpentry, to church, to ordinary things that felt anything but ordinary after what he had seen. Most days, he felt the ridge in his bones. Weather shifted and pain answered. His arm reminded him that it had once been torn open by fire. His breath reminded him of the lung taken by disease years later. Sleep came unevenly, and when it did come, it was sometimes followed by faces he had not expected to see again, standing just beyond reach. Yet, he did not grow bitter. Not about the war, not about the men who once hated him, not about the body he no longer fully had. He spoke when asked. He smiled when remembered. He forgave without ceremony. Forgiveness for him was not a grand performance. It was as automatic as breath. By the time honors arrived later in life, ceremonials deferred and retrospectives long overdue, Doss received them with polite humility. When interviewed decades later, he resisted the label of hero. He redirected praise without argument, toward God, toward the men he carried, toward the simple fact that he had done what had needed to be done. He never attempted to define courage. He just lived it. In 2006, 1 year before his death, a film adaptation brought his story to the forefront of cultural memory. It introduced his name to millions who had never heard it, and to some who only half remembered it. For younger generations, the ridge became a screen, the rope became a symbol, and Doss became briefly a voice again. But even then, he did not crave the spotlight. He had seen what light revealed too well. When he passed away on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, there were no cannons fired, no sky rewritten with color. His funeral was small, personal, quiet. Veterans attended. So did neighbors. A few spoke. Most simply listened. Men don't always die the way they lived. Doss did, somewhere between stillness and humility, between history and home. But what he left behind did not remain quiet, because when time settles, it does not erase, it clarifies. Years passed and his name gained gravity. Military academies spoke of him in halls built for strategy. Churches spoke of him from pulpits raised in peace. Classrooms spoke of him in lessons meant to inspire, though few could prepare anyone for the full weight of his choices. The men who had once feared serving beside him remembered the night differently as age softened edges. They remembered hands in the dark, a voice in smoke, and something strange, the feeling that, for one night, on one shattered ridge, war had been outnumbered. Everything after Hacksaw Ridge was a footnote, not because it was small, but because the ridge had been so large. It eclipsed the ordinary. It demanded remembrance, but remembrance was not the final chapter, because history ultimately asks something of the living. It does not merely tell, it questions. And the question Desmond Doss left behind had no simple answer. It only waited for those willing to confront it. There are battles history remembers for the ground they took, and others for what they revealed. Hacksaw Ridge revealed a man. Not one built from legend or exaggeration, but from quiet refusal and impossible endurance. Desmond Doss did not change the outcome of the war. He did not alter borders or sign treaties. He did not command armies or decide fate from behind a desk. What he did instead was smaller, and in war, smaller can be heavier. He refused to kill when killing was easier, when it was praised, when it was expected. He chose something harder, to stay while others fled, to heal when the world burned, to kneel in blood and call it duty. And in doing so, he broke something vast and invisible, the idea that courage wears only one uniform. Hacksaw Ridge did not fall because of power. It fell because one man would not leave, and that truth lingers longer than smoke. History often crowns the loudest, the fiercest, the men who broke things. Desmond Doss saved instead, and perhaps that is why his story takes so long to settle inside us. Because it is not about war, it is about what survives it. A rope, a prayer, a promise kept in the dark, and the quiet understanding, once the firing stops, that strength is not always measured by the lives a man ends, but sometimes by the ones he refused